This month we have Professor Emeritus William Hanson, or Bill Hanson, as many of us know him. Professor Hanson taught archaeology at the University of Glasgow for 40 years, becoming Professor of Roman Archaeology in 2000 and later retired in 2015. His primary focus has been Roman frontiers in many regions, particularly the role of aerial and satellite imagery to interpret these frontiers. His work has focused particularly in Scotland, with extensive work around Dalkeith and Croy Hill on the Antonine Wall, and both of these were published as monographs in 2007 and 2022, as well as fieldwork in Romania, and he was quite influential in introducing a lot of aerial and satellite survey techniques into fieldwork in Romania and Eastern Europe. He has a very extensive publication list. It would be it would take a whole lecture to go through all his publications, I think, with an extensive list of books, monographs, and academic papers, including his seminal works, Agricola and the Conquest of the North, and with the late Gordon Maxwell, a book on Rome's northern frontier, the Antonine Wall. More recently, he's published with Richard Jones and Nick Hannon, a book on the terrestrial and aerial survey of the Antonine Wall, which I think is one of the main topics he'll be talking about this evening. So I'd like you all to give a warm welcome to Professor Hanson.
For most of the 20th century, scholars considered the Antonine Wall to be a unitary monument. This is the site at Croy Hill behind me, which I'll refer to on more than one occasion. You can see what's left of the Antonine Wall running across here, which is actually the ditch to the north of it. The fort itself lies under there, but I'll come back to that site in due course. This is a plan from the 1960s, from the taken from Anne Robertson's handbook. Oops, I'll go back one. There, which shows you what was known or thought then. A linear barrier, a turf rampart, not a stone wall, built on a cobble base, fronted, as you saw, Croy Hill by a large ditch, some 40 Roman miles long, with forts every 2 or 3 miles, as indicated, or what were thought to be the case, indicated on the plan from Robertson from the 1960s. At that time, only 4 fortlets, equivalent to mile castles on Hadrian's Wall, were known. One at a Watling Lodge, which had been known since antiquarian times, which is the point at which the Roman road heading north passes through the wall on its way via Camelon northwards. At Duntocca, outside Glasgow, which is found during excavations in the late 40s, early 50s. At Glasgow Bridge, which is this one, found from the air by St Joseph, never excavated. And at Watling Lodge, this one also found from the air, but dug in the 1960s. So only 4 fortlets were known. A major change was suggested in 1975 by John Gillam formerly of this parish, and a former mentor of mine, noting the varying stratigraphic relationships between forts on the wall and the linear barrier itself. John hypothesized that there had been a major change of plan during the course of the construction of the Antonine Wall, and suggested that, in other words, that it wasn't a unitary monument. It had changed significantly during its construction. And he proposed that originally it was more or less following the outline plan of Hadrian's Wall in its developed form, with a linear barrier and forts every 8 miles or so, large or medium-sized forts, which we refer to on the Antonine Wall as primary forts, and fortlets, equivalent to the mile castles, every mile in between. But that during the construction of the Antonine Wall, this changed. There was a major dramatic change of plan, and lots more, some 11 more forts were added. So that's the kind of hypothesized plan 1, and then that's what we finish up with. So that I said there were forts some 2 to 3 miles apart along its length, quite closely spaced. Now, this spacing was always a problem because it's so much closer than other Roman frontiers, and I'll return to that towards the end, but that's as we were setting the scene. And this was a major change, I say in the mid-1970s, that was suggested. And several of us who were working on the wall at the time thought, well, we can look at this and we can check or test John's hypothesis. And one way that he suggested we could do that, because he was predicting that there would be more fortlets, more equivalent to Mar castles. So several of us, myself included, Gordon Maxwell, Lawrence Keppie, Jim Walker, started to look in that late 70s period for more fortlets. And lo and behold, we found them. Lawrence Keppie, assisted by James Walker, that was significant, found the fortlet at Shebegs. James Walker was brought up in a farm about there, so literally a few hundred meters. So he knew the site very well. He had played in the area when he was a child. If you go to the Antonine Wall, that stretch of the wall itself, the rampart and ditch, are preserved. But this is just in the field next door, and he predicted there was a site there on the basis of field walking. He thought he was probably looking for the missing fort, but he got Lawrence involved, and Lawrence came and they excavated and confirmed that there was indeed a fortlet. See, it's very small scale work, but it was enough to show that it was of one build with the Antonine Wall itself. This looks rather complicated, this kind of machine gun shaped trench, but that bit that's the rampart coming off of the fortlet. That's the Antonine Wall there, and then continuing on there. But what you will notice is that it sits on a little promontory. It projects slightly to the north, but it was of one build with the Antonine Wall base. So although it appears to have been contemporary with the building, it's quite clear that its location had been predetermined. Otherwise, you wouldn't get it on that little promontory sticking out to the north. I was digging at Croy Hill at the time, the site I showed you to begin with. I just started excavating there in 1975, not on the fort or the wall itself, but on the area around the fort. The fort had been dug by MacDonald in the 1930s. I was looking for evidence of civilian settlement in the area around the fort because of the proposed extension of a major quarry immediately to the south of the line of the wall. And in the course of, as one does as a site director, wandering around with the metaphorical cold towel on your head, thinking about the excavations, I wandered at one point to the north of the wall, to this point, in fact, and looked back and took a photograph because I thought, if I was putting a fortlet here, I would put it there on that spot there as arrow. Seemed to me an ideal location. This is the original photograph, which I've subsequently scanned. I've now lost the slide, so I can't rescan it, or I think it's probably gone into the archive. And I said, well, I think that would be a good place for a fortlet. And I suggested this to David Breeze, who was working for Historic Scotland at the time. He had actually been the one who had invited me to come and excavate at Croy Hill on their behalf. David was not immediately convinced. It took me, I wasn't supposed to be digging in the guardianship protected area. So this was in the guardianship protected area. But after a couple of years of persuasion, he let me put a couple of trenches in, or put one trench in, which originally was that trench. And as you can see from its length, I started up here somewhere, and because the fortlet was a bit further to the west than I had anticipated. But anyway, long trench. We found a bit of the rampart base there, and the next year came back and did some a little bit more excavation to confirm the relationship with the Antonine Wall. And as you can see here, that's the turf at the back of the Antonine Wall. We've taken the turf away at that point, but you can see we're down to the cobbled base. That's the curb of the cobbled base. The Antonine Wall does not continue on. It turns a corner and goes into the fortlet, and that's the turf of the fortlet. So again, it's built as one with the Antonine Wall. It's part of the original construction, the fortlet. Lawrence, again, with the assistance of Jim Walker. Jim had been working on some field walking at Kinneil, further to the eastern end of the wall, and again found Roman pottery and thought he was looking for the missing fort at Kinneil. And they excavated there and found another fortlet, which was then re-excavated, or it was more extensively excavated. This was in 1978, more extensively excavated a couple of years later, in 1980, as the Manpower Services Programme. So they were able to do more stripping of the site, so that the whole area was opened up. It survived only in the northern part. The rear, a few post holes survived, but not the rampart of the fortlet. But you can see the rampart base again is of one build. There's no curbs continuing on there. Though some people have tried to argue there was a break at this point, but it's tenuous. But it seems to be of one build. And again, there was a slight hint that it might have actually preceded the wall in concept, at least, and if not in structure. Sorry, I missed that one. And Lawrence and Jim again also found one at Cledden's, small-scale excavations, but enough to demonstrate that this is at the other end of the wall, at the western end, not far from Duntocca. And there they were able to show that the fortlet had preceded the wall. It was freestanding, and then the wall joined it later. But this is because they were dealing with the westernmost 4-mile sector of the construction, which was the last to be built, and I'll return to that later. So there we find all of the installations precede the wall in its construction. So that was the case there. So in the course of, and then one more, yes, sorry, I've forgotten, Gordon Maxwell, a brilliant piece of aerial photographic interpretation. I still struggle to find it. That's the line of the ditch showing as a crop mark of the Antonine wall. That's the line of a Roman temporary camp running around there. And that little curve is that, which was a ditch coming around towards the back of the Antonine wall, which is probably a fortlet. It's the least convincing of the examples. I dug it with Gordon to demonstrate that that's what there was, but there was a ditch, and it did seem to slightly post-date the ditch of the temporary camp, which is one of the construction camps. This is the site at Somerston. So in the course of about 5 years, we doubled, or more than doubled, the number of fortlets that were known, and that seemed to be sufficient to satisfy most of us. We did tend to continue, we tried to continue to find more, but we weren't able to at that time. We were sufficiently convinced, and the Gilham hypothesis, as a result, became the standard interpretation for about 20 years. And featured in the book that your chairman kindly mentioned that Gordon Maxwell and I wrote, called Rome's Most Northerly Frontier, the Antonine Wall. We explained that in some detail, which was published in 1983. So their thing stood until about 2015, or actually, no, about 2009 and then 2015. Along comes John Poulter, who does his work on the way the Romans surveyed things, roads and linear frontiers. And he suggested, from his survey of wall alignments, that it was likely, quote, that the sites of all the forts and the fortlets were chosen in advance. So he was suggesting, on the basis of the alignments that he was seeing and the relationship of the forts to those alignments, that all of the forts were primary. There were no primary and secondary forts, but they were all built at one time. And this was further developed by, keep doing that, wrong one, Eric Grafstahl, which he published in the Feshrift for me, along with others, including David, that developed this idea further and went on to challenge some of the secondary stratigraphic relationships to which John Gilham had referred in deciding that there were primary and secondary forts, to challenge those relationships and suggest that, in fact, there wasn't a major change of plan, but these differences just reflected phases in the building process. In other words, they were returning to the idea that the Antonine Wall was a unitary monument, at least in concept. Since that time, or since 2015, I've spent a lot of my time going back over the evidence and in essence, defending John Gilham's hypothesis. And I want to look first of all at some of the established evidence and then some of the new evidence, because some of what I'm going to say this evening is new and unpublished. Now, unlike this is the fortlet at Duntocka, which was excavated by Anne Robertson in the 1940s, late 40s, early 50s, and then she re-excavated the fortlet for the 1979 Limes Congress visit to Stirling, to Scotland, and left it on display. And you can see it there and then as a separate independent freestanding structure. Unlike the forts, there are no known examples of fortlets that can be shown stratigraphically to post-date the wall. They either are contemporary with it or earlier than it. By the wall, I mean the linear barrier. I say some even precede it, as at Duntocka, where you see it in the plan that she produced, or there we have the fortlet that you just saw with its own separate little ditch around it. And this is the geophysics subsequently, and that it was replaced by a small fort, and it was a very small fort, and only about half an acre or 0.8 of an acre, because it's probable that not that bit, but the whole of this was the fort, because that gateway remains central. You can see there's a sort of a causeway running through north of it, running through there. And there were actually 3 ditches, not 2, as she suggested, but that's a minor point, really. That the fortlet was replaced by a small fort before the wall ever got there, but that's back to this being in the westernmost 7 kilometers, 4 miles of the wall that was built last. And it indicates, as John had suggested, that the change came, this major change came during the construction process. So they hadn't finished building the wall when we moved from having a fortlet to having a fort at Duntocka. And that was the assumption for other sites too. And if we look at the evidence that I produced from Croy Hill, this supports that. That's the fortlet on its little raised area that we identified in 77, 78. This is the excavations that MacDonald had done in the 1930s, where he concluded from the relationship with the rampart there and there that this was a secondary fort, which had been added later, stratigraphically later than the linear barrier. Note also there are no ditches around here. He said there weren't any. He looked and couldn't find any. I'll come back to that. But this is way too close. That's about 80 meters rampart to rampart. So it's way too close for these to be contemporary. And don't anybody tell me, yes, well, it's only a similar distance between Housesteads and Marcastle 37. That kind of proves my point, because Housesteads and Marcastle 37 were not contemporary in building. Marcastle 37 precedes Housesteads. So the same, I would argue, here. Though there has been a great deal of disagreement about the sequence at Croy Hill. The stratigraphic evidence has been challenged. There's a famous water feature in the corner going back. It's about there, but not on this plan, which is stone built with steps leading down. It's actually a cistern coming down to coming down to a spring. That's the spring, and you can see MacDonald records the fact that as they were digging it, it was filling it with water very quickly. So they tapped into a natural spring, but the thing is that the overflow from said spring runs under the Antonine wall. So this has to be contemporary with or predate the Antonine wall. But in fact, it's also clear that the rampart of the fort actually is later than this cistern. So it doesn't suggest the fort is contemporary, because the fort is later than the cistern. Though there's then an argument about what was the cistern doing, but the stratigraphic evidence is clear. But as I said, there's been some dispute. Eric Grafstahl has suggested that one should take the cistern there join it with the bathhouse, which was excavated by MacDonald only briefly, so we don't know a great deal about it. And that the reason that this fort is secondary is it's not the original fort on the site. They originally planned to build a fort here, for which there is really no evidence. This is totally hypothetical. Originally, when he suggested it, he had his ramparts coming down here and round, till I pointed out that we dug here and we hadn't found any sign of any ramparts. So he just said, well, okay, in that case, it was just the frontage. Now, that's not impossible, but just the frontage. But in fact, and he linked it with the section of unexcavated ditch at Troy Hill, which is slightly problematic, but I say I'll return to that. So there's been much disagreement about the sequence. But as I said, this isn't, he thought this was something to do with the bathhouse, that it was a form of sewage outlet for the bathhouse, which it clearly isn't. It's a spring, it's a cistern. And in combining it with the evidence of the uncut ditch. But if you look at that, this is it. If you can go and visit it, it's very prominent, very obvious that they hadn't got cut through at this point. And it's that point there. The fort lies roughly from there to there. The fortlet's up here. But if you look at the topography, the best place to put a fort is where it is, or was, underneath the site of the later farmstead, between the fortlet and the trees there. That's the best place for it to be. The ground slopes downwards afterwards. It gets very wet. You can see it's damp there. That water's coming from the spring, in fact. And the explanation for the uncut ditch is quite simple. It's naturally outcropping, or it's outcropping to the surface, basalt, which is not the easiest thing to cut through with a pick and shovel. And that is why there were no ditches also around that side of the fort, as MacDonald recorded. That's the major quarry that was continuing for some time afterwards, digging out that basalt. So it's simply that they hadn't completed the ditch at that point because they couldn't easily get through the basalt. It isn't because there was an earlier fort feeding into this area, as Grafstar has suggested. But that's evidence that's been argued about. There wasn't, shall we say, general agreement. But I wanted to look at new evidence, try and find some new evidence, and mainly this was from geophysics or from LIDAR, starting by looking at some of the primary forts, particularly at Balmuldy, Auchendavi, and Mumrills. This is the geophysics of Balmuldy. I won't go through it in detail. It was well known from the excavations from the 1930s that Balmuldy was there before the wall. It was even built with little wing walls, almost as if they were expecting a stone wall that didn't come, and the turf rampart abuts those wing walls. But what's interesting from the geophysics is that this odd narrowing of the ditch to the north of the fort, as recorded by the excavation, that's it there, is because there are two ditches. That's what that is, running around, coming around. So the fort at at Balmuldy was freestanding for a time with its own ditches around it. And we'll see that again, because if we look at Mumrills, which has long been the largest fort on the wall, 6.5 acres, it's at a point where there's a major sort of change of orientation. So probably the fort is earlier, and the wall is coming in to adjust to its location. The geophysics again has shown that there are two ditches to the north, there and there. I know it's difficult stuff, this geophysics. I've got used to it because I've looked at so much of it, but it's not the easiest thing to interpret. But that's what those lines are. So again, this one seems to have been freestanding for a time. And then Auchendavi, there was a lot of debate about if there were primary and secondary forts. Was Auchendavi primary or was Bar Hill primary? Because the Bar Hill is separate from the wall, doesn't have a relationship in that sense. But it's clear from the geophysics that Auchendavi is the primary site. It has a causeway through the ditches. It has double ditches to the north, as we've seen at Balmuldy, as we've seen at mongrels. It was a separate, probably a separate entity. And what's more, it was also originally intended to be bigger, because that's the eastern side, that's the western side of the fort as we know it. But the geophysics shows that this double ditch system to the north extends rather further to the west, and there are these little ditch offsets coming from behind it. So as if originally when it was planned, it was going to be, rather than ending here, it was going to end here, and the ditches are going to go around there, but they didn't do it that way in the end. They reduced its size, which is again an issue that we'll see repeated elsewhere. So the evidence supports the idea that the primary forts were indeed, those primary forts were indeed primary and being freestanding. But I also wanted to look afresh at some of the secondary forts. The ones arrowed, Castle Hill, Rough Castle, and Inverhaven. Rough Castle, if you go to visit the Antonine wall, it's almost certainly you go to Rough Castle because it's the best preserved of the sites on the wall. That's it from the air. But it's been cleaned up a great deal by Historic Scotland or Historic Environment Scotland or its predecessors to be put on display. But the early excavations, turn of the 19th century, demonstrated that it was a secondary construction. You can see here, that's the rampart of the Antonine wall, but that's the Antonine wall base, and it abuts the rampart of the fort. There was some dispute about whether you could see it in the turf rampart, but on the other side of the fort you can there, though you can't see the cobble base. So it seemed to be quite clear that the fort at Rough Castle was a secondary, it was a later addition, but it was suggested it had a primary causeway, as we saw at Auchendavid. Therefore, there was a discrepancy between the evidence, and you could argue the case that it was just a difference in the timing of the construction rather than something more basic. But in fact, looking at the evidence for this, and it was the geophysics that attracted my attention to it. When we looked at the geophysics of the causeway, the signal we're getting was not of a primary causeway. It's of something that's been put back. And I went hunting in the archives for photographs, and this is a photograph looking along the Antonine Wall ditch to that causeway. There's a gap. It's a bridge, not a causeway. There's a gap underneath for these to go under. As it stands, as it's been reconstituted, as we see it on the ground now, this is a complete 1960s invention or confection or reconstruction. You could, no point redigging it because it was dug in, it was constructed in the 1960s. Certainly when they dug in 1904, they did find a causeway of sorts, but there are various reasons for suggesting that it was not primary. Well, first of all, it doesn't align with the fort. It should have, like if you're coming into the gate, you should be coming to the middle of the headquarters building, and it doesn't quite, it's off slightly. Secondly, the causeway is at an oblique angle. It crosses the ditch at an oblique angle. Thirdly, as the fill is described by the excavators in 1904, it was described as, or it's likened to the glacis, which is the upcast mound, the material taken from the ditch and thrown to the north. In which case, if that is likened to that material, it's secondary, it's later, it's been moved, it's not primary, in situ, undisturbed subsoil. And it's also integrated with the line of the roadway, which itself clearly is later than the upcast mound. And then finally, if you look at projecting line, which has been suggested was this is LiDAR showing you the line of the tracks leading beyond it, thought to be heading towards the fort at Kenmon. In fact, if you follow that one up and then it turns sharply right and heads for a 19th century farmstead, which is what that is, and similarly that one is heading for the other side of the 19th century farmstead. So those trackways suggest that it's all linked into 19th century farming activity. So I would suggest that the causeway is a myth. The primary causeway is a complete myth. So that discrepancy between the stratigraphic evidence falls at that point. And then if we go to Inverhaven, this gives me nightmares, sorry. Try interpreting that. That's geophysics. It's a complete nightmare. The reason is because Grangemouth Refinery is about there. So this is all things running into or out of Grangemouth Refinery. There's an electricity substation here. So all these dipolars are in the geophysics are caused by modern interference. But that one was a pipeline running through in the 1990s, which was excavated by AOC in Scotland. And lo and behold, they found back at the Antonine Wall cobble base with its curbstones and abutting it a rampart. So that's secondary. Then they couldn't explain it or they weren't happy explaining it with what they could find from the excavations, and they thought it might be an expansion, one of these signalling platforms, but it is actually almost certainly the rampart of the small fort that was known to be there from excavations by Anne Robertson. The geophysics picks up the curve of the ditch. You believe me or not, the curve of the ditch running around, but it is an absolute nightmare to interpret the geophysics, not helped by the fact it's also interfered with by a Mesolithic shell min, which plays havoc with the geophysical responses. Probably a bathhouse here, but also the line of the ditch then curves round, which was new evidence that wasn't known before, so that it faces the line of the ditch on the other side of the river. But it would indicate that we have at Inverhaven a small fort about the same size as the fort at Duntocka. But there had been a good deal of difficulty with finding the fort at Inverhaven to begin with, let alone defining what its relationship was with the Antonine Wall. And then at Castle Hill, this is the site you can see from the air, from Google Earth. It's never been excavated. It's partly under this copse of trees next to the farm. This is the LiDAR, where you can see the platform, just about see the platform of the fort running around there. The geophysics makes it clearer and makes it clear that the fort here, we're back to double ditches again to the north, and a disjuncture with the line of the Antonine Wall. That's the line of the Antonine Wall coming in. There's a disjuncture so that the Antonine Wall is secondary, but this is within the last 7 kilometers. So it fits into that section of the wall that was built last. So it's not a primary fort in the sense of being there before the others in terms of plan, but it was constructed before the wall because this bit of the wall was the last bit of the wall to be built of the linear hand. It's long been thought there was a fortlet here because Roy suggested in his plan of the site that there might be. It was thought to be this, a small plateau that was visible on the ground, but that clearly overlies the ditches of the fort running under here on the LiDAR, so it can't be that. And in fact, if you look at that, it's a manhole cover. And speaking to the farmer, well, he's not there now because it's derelict, but speaking to the farmer, he said that was it's a well, and that was their water supply until they got piped water in the 1960s. So ignore that. That's nothing to do with the Romans. There was, however, hiding underneath there, this is Roy's plan, which suggests there was a small fortlet in that corner. There is, well, you might not believe me, there is a line of a ditch running around here, around there, and heading up there, suggestive of a small enclosure in that corner. So we're putting together bits of evidence that suggest that there was there a fortlet. And then we've got same sort of sequence as we've seen at Duntocka of a fortlet replaced by a fort before the wall gets there, because it's in that same sector of the wall. One criticism that came from John Poulter of the evidence for the change of plan was that since the 1970s, the early 80s, we haven't found more fortlets. Well, we've started again with just Castle Hill is one that came out from the analysis of the geophysics. Another is pure serendipity, which is at Beauclair. This is the site of the Bearsden bathhouse. David was digging here in the 1970s and indeed looking for a fortlet and couldn't find one. And that's because it was here, about 800 meters away. And that was purely fortuitous. It was found as part of an assessment of somebody building an extension to their house. And they found a bit of what is clearly rampart base at right angles to the wall just behind the line of it. So that appeared to be another fortlet, entirely by serendipity at Beauclair, discovered in 2017. And then, much to Lawrence Kepp's annoyance, at Carleath, geophysics at Carleath revealed that's the line of the rampart of the wall. That's the ditch continuing on there. You can't see it in here because of all the stuff thrown out when they were building these houses. And there you've got, again, a bit of rampart coming off the back. And he trenched to about here and didn't quite get there. He missed it by about 2 meters in his excavations. But that's been found by geophysics at Carleath. Again, that's in the last section, the last 7 kilometers. And then most recently, at Bonyside, just by Roughcastle, the fort at Roughcastle, that's the Rowan Tree Burn, so the fort at Roughcastle is about there. We have a fortlet. It's quite a large fortlet, but we have a fortlet, ramparts attached to the back of the wall within the guardianship area. And that's about, I don't know, about 280 meters from the fort at Roughcastle, which we've already discussed as being secondary. And then this fits in as a primary fortlet within a couple of 100 meters of it. So not exactly on the same site, but sufficiently nearby to be unlikely to be contemporary. So most of that evidence was published last year in the book on the geophysics on the Antonine Wall that are published with Richard Jones and Nick Hannon. But the most recent work I've been doing is looking at the evidence for the distance slabs and what they can tell us. Now, we're very fortunate in the Antonine Wall that we have these amazing inscriptions, the distance slabs as they're called. These unique, often highly decorated, as here, highly decorated monumental inscriptions that record the building of lengths of the wall as built by different legions involved in the process. So we see the example of Dalnotta, lots of the emperor's titles. Then we get the vexillation, the 6th Legion, and it actually refers to what they're building, which is unusual. Opwas Valley, the work of the rampart. They actually tell us what they're constructing, which is rare. And then it says P pays 4,141. So they built 4,141 feet of the linear barrier. Fantastic. And then Somerston, we have the equivalent, but this time we're talking about it in per MP, millia passawun, miles or thousands of paces. And so the inscriptions either record the construction in feet in the the westernmost 7 kilometer section, the last section, or in paces or millia passawun, further to the west. So we find that there is a concentration of inscriptions from this sector between Castle Hill and the Clyde, and that's because there were more inscriptions erected because the distances that they were building were shorter. Essentially, they got to here, were distracted by something, and then came back to it in order to finish it quickly. Whereas previously they divided up the sections into between 3,000 and 4,000 paces. For this last sector, they then split it into much smaller segments to speed up the process of finishing it, which is why they expressed it in feet. They wanted to keep the numbers high, I think was what they were doing, the statistics. So it looked like it was a decent length, even though it's quite short. But that's why we have so many more in this sector. So the concentration, say, to the west of Castle Hill was because it was the last sector to be constructed. Now, recent analysis of the LiDAR data, which allows us to measure the length of the wall more accurately, because we can allow for the third dimension. It's not two-dimensional map type measurement, it's three-dimensional on the ground type measurement. So you've got a very precise record, which is what the Romans would have recorded. So we can equate the LiDAR distances with what the Romans would have constructed. We can relate those to the distance slabs. And we have for that first, that sector from Castle Hill to the Clyde, we have representative distance slabs for every section that was built. And we can reconstruct, therefore, that process by comparing the length in feet, in Roman feet. This was, originally it was argued that they use a different foot, a pace Drusianus rather than a pace monetalis. I won't go into the complications of that, except to say that it was the pace monetalis. We now know that, so we can forget the pace Drusianus and the paper that was written about that, which is now dead. We can equate then the length in pedes and the metric equivalent, translate the length in pedes into its metric equivalent. Now, they don't quite correspond with the LiDAR length, as you can see here, by about less than 400 meters. But we've already established that the installations in this sector had already been built. The fortlets and the forts were built before the wall itself was constructed. So the wall, the record of construction on the distance slabs, which is recording the building of the vallum, the rampart, doesn't include those sectors. So we have to take those out. So if we subtract from the distances that are recorded on the distance slabs, comes to 6,500 meters or more. If we subtract from the LiDAR distance an allowance for the forts and fortlets that have been built, it comes amazingly close. It corresponds to within 4 meters, which is not bad over 7 kilometers. Given the potential inaccuracies involved. But having done that for this sector, having confirmed it's the pace monetalis, done that comparison, we can look at it for other sectors where they were building and recording the distances in paces. And there's if we look at the next 3 building sectors east of Castle Hill, because that's the point of change, because we have 2 distance slabs from Castle Hill, 1 in feet, 1 in paces, so they go in the opposite way. And we have the other ones, and the ones beyond that, up to Eastermains, Somerset and Eastermains, they have this funny length, 366.5. It's a very, very strange figure. I'll return to that. But we have 3 of them, so we can trace those to Eastermains. And again, if we make due allowance for the forts and fortlets, the figure that we get to by comparing the length in paces this time with the LiDAR length is within 40 meters, allowing for the pre-existing forts, which would include Castle Hill, but Balmoody, and on beyond that, we allow for those, we get to within, I say, about 40 meters. It's 40 meters too much, in fact, in terms of deduction. But that's not bad over, what, 16 kilometers to be within 40 meters. But what is also clear is that we aren't making any allowance for the secondary forts, the forts at Kirkintilloch and Blair's and Cadder, because if you add those in and say, well, if they've been built already, and you take the allowance out of the sector that was recorded on the distance slabs, we'd actually be even further out. We'd be several hundred meters out in terms of the compliance with what it says on the distance slabs. So that supports again the idea that they were indeed secondary. They were built later, that the primary forts were indeed primary, the fortlets were indeed primary, but the so-called secondary forts were indeed secondary. There's also a very interesting hypothesis put forward by Mark Hassel some years ago in 1983, which is I always liked it as a hypothesis. It tried to make sense of these funny 3, 6, 6.5 distances recorded, because it is an odd distance to record, and consistently on several inscriptions. And what he suggested was that in those sectors, if we have 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, takes us to Easter Mains. The location of the distance slab at distance slabs, because there are 2 at Easter Mains, is reasonably closely indicated from the description of where they came from, where they were found. He said, well, we've got 3 times 366.5 or thereabouts. If we add in 3,000 meters, because we have one otherwise unattested in terms of its location, distance slab, which does record there being a construction of 3,000 meters, 3,000 paces. If you add that in and assume that there were 2 more like it, it all adds up to 20 Roman miles divided by 3 into 6 different sections. 3 of 3,000, 3 of 366. You can do the maths, it comes to near enough 20 Roman miles. And that seemed a nice explanation. It kind of fitted the evidence, and therefore he suggested that that was the first sector to be built. Half of the wall, roughly 20 Roman miles in that central sector, was the first to be built, and that's why we have this strange division. But if you actually look at the evidence, the LiDAR evidence and the distance lab evidence in more detail, it cannot work, because if he was right, you would expect the next 3 sectors to be 3,000 paces long. The only other distance lab we know is from Hagnau, which is this one. We don't have a distance on it, but everyone agrees it is a distance slab. It was found just south of the wall. It had been reused clearly, but not moved terribly far. And it relates almost certainly to an excavation. There's Hagnau, it's a natural prominence. It tends to be attributed to the nearby farm at Arnie Bog, but that's where it was found. If we look at the excavation evidence from Lawrence Kepi, we have at the back of the rampart here, Hagnau, this platform, which is very neatly built with squared ends. This is it. And interestingly, importantly, there was no evidence in the interstices between the stones of any turf. So there's not a repair to a collapsed back of the wall. It's a stone base. What would you need a stone base for? Well, you've got these great big inscriptions to put up. So the most logical explanation is that this is one of the, and there is a distance slab from within 100 meters at this point. This is where they would have erected the distance slab. So it seems a reasonable argument. But if you look at the distance to Hagnau from Easter Mains, you can't get it to work with any factor of 3,000 meters. It should be either 6,000, 3,000, 6,000, 9,000, but it doesn't work. It's 7,400 or something. It just doesn't work. So much as the Hassel hypothesis is attractive, it doesn't work. Finally, we'll look at the far end of the wall. There's been a lot of argument about the Brezhnev slab and indeed whether it represents the end of the wall. Antiquarian accounts suggest it was probably at further down the coast. The excavations by Lawrence Kepi and Jeff Bailey failed to find any evidence of the wall here around the site of where the distance slab, the massive distance slab from Bridgeness was recovered. So suggesting that maybe it was the wall continued around the coast a little way. Regression analysis, that's what that red line is, suggests that the Roman coastline was about there. So if we add that on, that distance on to the distance we get on the relevant distance slab from Bridgeness, and run it westwards, we get to within the 4,652 paces on the distance slab, we get to within 7 meters of the east bank of the River Avon, with no allowance for existing structures. That distance on the distance slab from Bridgeness, adding in that little bit extra there, takes us almost exactly to the River Avon. And I would suggest, therefore, that that indicates that this is one of the first sectors to be built. That confirms the suggestion that was long made, that this is one of the first sectors to be built, that the fortlets were integral with the building process. They aren't separated out. We saw the example at Kinneil of one of them. So they were part and parcel of that construction. The checking for either by geophysics or by excavation for the line continuing towards the fort at Cariden has failed to find any evidence. So it's a non-starter. So somewhere it goes to Bridgeness, and that was always thought to be the case. And we can forget all this. It's just no evidence to support it. So we get then the distance from Bridgeness all the way to the Avon there, and that fits in again with the distance slabs. So from all that disparate evidence from LiDAR, from geophysics, from analysis of the relationships of the structures on the wall to the wall itself, it seems to be quite clear that John Gillam was absolutely right. That originally the wall was built broadly to mirror in concept Hadrian's wall after the fort decision. That's as we would have it. We still have a lot of fortlets to find, but it was slightly different. There was a military way incorporated, and there don't appear to be any watchtowers. The word watchtower has not passed my lips. There is no evidence for watchtowers, and I'm beginning to suspect there weren't any. And then there was a major change of plan during the construction, which resulted in lots more fortlets, 11 new fortlets, and at this very close basically. That raises a question, why on earth do they need to be so closely spaced? What caused this? If there was a major change of plan which resulted in the addition of 11 new forts, many of which are very small, it includes the 5 smallest on the wall, all less than 2 acres. 80% of the forts are only 1.5 to 2.5 miles apart, incredibly close together. Why? Well, this sequence of development only makes sense to me if there had been some sort of major response. The creation of a hard border on this line may well have split existing social groups and stimulated a localized hostile reaction, perhaps demonstrated by the evidence from Lecky, but my hypothesis doesn't depend upon this. The Brock at Lecky, which is only a few miles to the north in the Forth Valley, seems to have been destroyed by the Romans, even Ballistabolt, even though they had been in contact with the Romans and in receipt of Roman material, including Samian, for some time. So, but I say my hypothesis doesn't rest on that. That's just a possible example of the unrest that would have been caused. But the general principle, you build a hard border through people's territory and they get upset. We should know that from other parts not that far away in the British Isles. This response would have delayed the building process. It would have stimulated the spreading out of the garrison in a more defensive posture. Adding a further 11 forts would have additionally slowed down the work, hence the need to split up the unfinished last sector, the 4.5 Roman miles, 7 kilometers sector at the western end had been left, split it up into smaller units to speed up completion of the project. And hence the spreading out of the garrison in additional forts along the line. But this would also have created manpower shortages. Hence the fact that these secondary forts tend to be smaller, generally much smaller. So all the evidence, for me at least, fits together. All these disparate bits and pieces fit together that there was a major change of plan during the course of construction, to which the Romans responded in a rather knee-jerk way by adding in lots of new forts. And I must admit, I've long thought, and I know David doesn't agree with me, long thought that's also the explanation on Hadrian's Wall for the placing of forts on the line of the wall. That's why I think that's why they did it, and why they all project to the north to maximize the firepower they could get to the north of the wall. It makes, to me, much more sense. So for me, all the evidence for the building of the Antonine Wall seems to fit into a logical and coherent story, and I'll leave you with that.